A millionaire gave $500 to a homeless woman to buy a bouquet of flowers and then saw her at the grave of his beloved who died 20 years ago. The late afternoon sun filtered through the imposing windows of Jack Thompson's office, bathing the luxurious room in a golden glow that contrasted brutally with the darkness that inhabited his heart. At 45, Jack was the very image of success. Owner of one of the country's most innovative technology companies, possessor of a fortune that grew day by day, and recognized as one of the most influential men in the circles of power. However, not all the money in the world could fill the emptiness he felt in his soul. With a tired sigh, Jack rose from his Italian leather armchair and approached the window. From there he could see the skyline of the city stretching out before him, a concrete and glass testimony to his financial empire. But his eyes didn't see the skyscrapers or the lights that were starting to flicker in the growing dusk. In his mind, there was only one image: Sarah's face, Sarah Parker. It had been 19 years since he lost her, but the pain was still as fresh as the first day. He closed his eyes, allowing himself to immerse in memories of the woman who had been his everything, her wavy brown hair that danced in the breeze, her honey-colored eyes that shone with a mixture of intelligence and sweetness, her crystalline laugh that seemed to light up even the darkest day. "Mr. Thompson," his assistant's voice through the intercom abruptly pulled him from his thoughts. "Your car is ready." Jack blinked, returning to the present. "Thank you, Lisa, I'll be down in a moment." With mechanical movements, the product of years of routine, Jack picked up his coat and briefcase before leaving. His gaze lingered on a framed photograph on his desk, him and Sarah embracing and smiling with the sea in the background. It was taken during their last vacation together, just weeks before the accident that took her away forever. The journey in the luxurious vehicle passed in silence. Jack distractedly observed the city streets through the tinted windows, his mind wandering between the past and the present. The driver, accustomed to his boss's muteness, especially on this particular day, didn't attempt to initiate any conversation. Finally, the car stopped in front of a flower shop. Jack descended from the vehicle and entered the store, where he was greeted by the owner with an understanding smile. "Mr. Thompson, the white lilies are ready as every year," said the woman, handing him a beautiful bouquet. Jack nodded silently, paid, and left the store. The sweet aroma of the flowers brought a new wave of memories. Sarah laughing as he gave her a similar bouquet on their first anniversary. Sarah tending to the lilies, she planted in the garden of the house they shared. Sarah holding a bouquet of white lilies on their wedding day. The cemetery was quiet and lonely when they arrived. Jack walked along familiar paths until he reached a white marble headstone. Gently, he placed the lilies in front of the grave and knelt, his fingers softly tracing the letters engraved on the stone. "Sarah Parker, beloved wife and generous soul, may her light continue to shine eternally." "Hello, my love," whispered Jack, his voice breaking slightly. "Another year has passed. I miss you more every day." For the next hour, Jack remained there speaking softly to Sarah. He told her about the company's progress, the new projects he was developing, the charitable works he had initiated in her name. He talked about his fears, his hopes, his truncated dreams, and as every year, he asked for forgiveness for not having been there to protect her, for not having been able to save her. When he finally stood up, the sun was already setting, tinting the sky in reddish and golden hues. Jack said goodbye with a kiss on the headstone and walked back to the car, feeling emotionally exhausted, but somehow a little lighter. The return trip to the city was as silent as the one there. Jack was looking out the window, lost in his thoughts, when something caught his attention. On a corner, under the dim light of a street lamp, he saw a young woman sitting on the ground. Her clothes were worn and dirty, her hair tangled, and beside her was a small sign asking for help. "Stop," Jack ordered the driver. The car stopped smoothly next to the curb. Jack lowered the window and observed the woman more closely. There was something about her in the way she held her head high despite her circumstances that reminded him of Sarah and her unbreakable dignity. "Miss," called Jack. The woman looked up, surprised. Her eyes, an indefinite shade between green and brown, met Jack's. For a moment he felt as if time had stopped. "Yes?" She responded with a soft but firm voice. Jack took out his wallet and extracted several bills. "Here," he said, extending the money to her. "It's $500. Use it for whatever you need." The woman looked at him with a mixture of amazement and distrust. I can't accept so much money, sir." "Please, I insist," said Jack. Then, not knowing exactly why, he added, "Use it to buy flowers for someone special if you want." After a moment of hesitation, the woman took the money with trembling hands. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes filled with tears. "God bless you." Jack nodded and closed the window. As the car drove away, he couldn't help but look in the rearview mirror. The image of the woman, now standing and holding the bills against her chest, was etched in his mind. That night, in the solitude of his luxurious mansion, Jack poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in his study. The walls were covered with photographs, him and Sarah at different stages of their life together, newspaper clippings about his business achievements, images of the charitable projects he had initiated in memory of his wife. As he drank slowly, his mind wandered between memories of Sarah and the image of the woman on the street. There was something about her, a spark of determination in her eyes that intrigued him. He wondered what story was behind that young woman, what circumstances had led her to that situation. The sound of the phone interrupted his thoughts. It was Lisa, his assistant. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sorry to bother you at this hour, but an urgent email has just arrived about the project in South America. They need your approval to proceed." Jack sighed. Work never ended. "It's all right, Lisa. I'll be in the office early tomorrow to review it." After hanging up, Jack stared at the empty glass in his hand. Tomorrow would be another day of meetings, important decisions, and business strategies. His life would continue its normal course, full of professional successes and empty of true personal satisfaction. But something had changed. The encounter with the woman on the street had awakened something in him, a curiosity he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he went to sleep thinking about something other than the past and Sarah. The next morning, Jack woke up with a strange feeling of anticipation. As he prepared to go to the office, he found himself thinking again about the woman on the street. Had she used the money to buy flowers, as he had suggested? Or had she spent it on more urgent needs? Shaking his head to push away those thoughts, Jack headed to his company. The day passed like any other. Meetings, calls, important decisions. But in the back of his mind, an idea persisted: to visit the cemetery again. When the sun began to set, Jack surprised everyone in the office by announcing he was leaving early. "Lisa, cancel my commitments for the rest of the day," he ordered his assistant as he left. "But sir, the video conference with the investors," Lisa began. "Reschedule it," Jack interrupted. "Something important came up." Without waiting for a response, Jack left the building and headed to his car. This time, he decided to drive himself. He needed the control, the feeling of doing something active instead of just being carried along by the current of his routine life. The journey to the cemetery seemed shorter than usual. Jack parked and walked quickly towards Sarah's grave, not stopping this time to buy flowers. His heart was beating hard, though he wasn't sure why. As he approached Sarah's headstone, Jack stopped short. There, kneeling in front of the grave, was the woman from the night before. She wore the same worn clothes, but her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and in front of the headstone, fresh and fragrant, was a bouquet of white lilies. Jack stood still, observing the scene with a mixture of confusion and amazement. The woman was speaking softly, her words inaudible to him, as she gently caressed the flower petals. Finally, unable to contain his curiosity, Jack stepped forward. A branch cracked under his foot, alerting the woman to his presence. She turned quickly, her eyes widening with surprise as she recognized him. "You," she murmured, standing up. Jack began, but stopped, not knowing what to say. How to explain his presence? how to ask why she was there in front of his wife's grave. The woman looked at him steadily, a mix of emotions crossing her face. Finally, with a soft but firm voice, she said, "I think we have a lot to talk about, sir." Jack nodded slowly, feeling he was on the edge of a precipice, about to discover something that would change his life forever. "Yes," he responded. "I think we do." The sun was setting on the horizon, bathing the cemetery in a golden light. Two figures stood in front of a white marble headstone, united by fate and by the memory of a woman they had both loved. As day gave way to night, Jack Thompson felt that for the first time in 19 years, he was about to wake up from a long and painful dream. The silence in the cemetery was almost palpable as Jack and the woman stared at each other, both unsure of how to proceed. The wind whispered among the tombstones, gently rustling the petals of the white lilies that lay in front of Sarah's grave. "My name is Jack Thompson," he finally said, breaking the silence. "Sarah, she was my wife." The woman nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Jack's. "I know," she replied softly. "My name is Emma Sarah. She saved my life." Jack felt the world wobble beneath his feet. Sarah had saved this woman? How? When? Thousands of questions crowded his mind, but before he could formulate any, Emma continued speaking. "Perhaps we should sit down," she suggested, pointing to a nearby bench. "It's a long story." Jack nodded mechanically and followed her to the bench. Once seated, Emma took a deep breath and began her tale. "I was barely 8 years old when Sarah found me. I was living on the streets, abandoned, with no one to care for me. One cold winter night, I had taken refuge in the doorway of a building. I was hungry, freezing, scared. And then she appeared." Emma smiled softly at the memory, her eyes shining with unshed tears. Sarah was coming out of a charity dinner. She was wearing a beautiful evening gown and a fur coat. She could have walked past like so many others had done, but she didn't. She stopped, knelt beside me, and asked if I was okay. When she saw I was shivering from the cold, she took off her coat and wrapped me in it. Jack listened attentively, his heart beating fast. This had happened during his marriage to Sarah, and yet he knew nothing about it. "Sarah took me to her home that night," Emma continued. "She fed me, bathed me, dressed me in clean clothes, and then she offered me a home." "But how is that possible?" interrupted Jack, unable to contain his confusion. "I never—" Emma looked at him with a mixture of understanding and sadness. "Sarah explained to me that she couldn't take me to live with her and her husband. She said it was complicated, that it could cause problems, but she promised she would take care of me." Jack felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Had Sarah kept this child's existence a secret? Why? "Sarah bought a small apartment," Emma continued. "She hired an older woman, Mrs. Rogers, to live with me and take care of me. Sarah came to visit me almost every day. She brought me books, helped me with my schoolwork, took me to the park. She became the mother I never." Her tears were now flowing freely down Emma's cheeks, and Jack felt his own eyes moistening. "For years, Sarah was my entire world. She taught me to read, to write, to dream. She talked to me about how important education was, how it could change my life, and I adored her. To me, she was an angel who had descended from heaven to save me." Jack listened in silence, his mind trying to reconcile this new information with the image he had of his wife Sarah. Had always been compassionate, generous, but this went beyond anything he had imagined. "When I turned 15, Emma continued, Sarah told me the truth. She told me she wasn't my biological mother, that she had found me on the street and decided to take care of me. She explained why she had to keep it a secret, why she couldn't take me to live with her and her husband." "What reason did she give you?" asked Jack, his voice barely a whisper. Emma looked him directly in the eyes. "She told me that her husband was an important man, that they had a complicated public life, that adopting a street child could cause a scandal, negatively affect her husband's company. Sarah, she didn't want to cause you problems, Jack." Jack felt the world crumbling around him all these years. He had believed he knew Sarah completely, and now he discovered that she had led a parallel life, a life he knew nothing about. I don't understand," Jack murmured, running a hand through his hair. Why didn't she tell me? I would have understood. I would have... Sarah loved you deeply, Emma interrupted gently. She always talked about you with so much affection, with so much admiration. I think she feared that if she told you, you would feel obligated to accept me into your life. She didn't want to put you in that position. Jack stood up abruptly from the bench, needing to move to process all this information. He walked a few steps, turning his back to Emma, his mind a whirlwind of contradictory emotions and thoughts. What happened next? He finally asked. Without turning around, Emma sighed. Sarah continued taking care of me until the accident. When she died, I was 17 years old. Suddenly, I was left with nothing. Mrs. Rogers, who was already elderly, couldn't continue caring for me. The money Sarah had left for my maintenance quickly ran out. I went back to the streets. Jack turned around sharply upon hearing this. Horror reflected on his face. You went back to the streets, but why didn't you seek help? Why didn't you look for me? Emma smiled sadly. And what was I going to tell you? Hello? I'm your late wife's secret adopted daughter. No, Jack, I couldn't do. That Sarah had always taught me to be strong, to fend for myself, so that's what I tried to do. But you've been living on the street all these years, said Jack, guilt and remorse evident in his voice. Emma nodded. It's been difficult, very difficult, but every year without fail I saved, enough to buy white lilies and bring them here. It was my way of honoring Sarah's memory, of thanking her for everything she did for me. Jack sat back down on the bench, overwhelmed by emotions. Silence stretched between them for several minutes, each lost in their own thoughts. Why are you telling me all this now? Jack finally asked. Emma looked at him, a small smile forming on her lips. Because last night, a stranger gave me $500 and suggested I buy flowers for someone special. When I saw you, I knew it couldn't be a coincidence. Sarah always said there are no coincidences, only fate in disguise. Jack felt something stirring inside him. For the first time in 19 years, he felt a spark of something that dangerously resembled hope. Emma, he said slowly, I'd like to know more about you, about your life with Sarah. If you're okay with that, of course. Emma nodded, her eyes shining with unshed tears. I'd love that, Jack. I think Sarah would have liked us to get to know each other. As the sun set on the horizon, tinting the sky in reddish and golden hues, Jack and Emma remained seated on that cemetery bench, sharing stories about the woman they had both loved. And although neither of them knew it at that moment, this encounter would mark the beginning of a new chapter in their lives, a chapter full of discoveries, forgiveness, and perhaps a second chance for both of them. When they finally stood up to leave, Jack looked once more at Sarah's headstone. For the first time in 19 years, he felt the weight in his heart lighten a little. Emma, he said, turning to the young woman, would you like to have dinner with me? I think we have a lot to talk about. Emma smiled, a smile that lit up her tired face and reminded Jack of the way Sarah used to smile. I'd love to, she replied, as they walked together towards the cemetery exit. Jack couldn't help but think that Sarah, somehow, was still taking care of both of them. And for the first time in a long time, he felt that maybe, just maybe, the future could be a little less lonely. The restaurant Jack had chosen was elegant, but discreet, located on a quiet street in the city center. As the maitre led them to a secluded table, Jack couldn't help but notice the curious glances some diners were casting in their direction. It wasn't usual to see him in public with a woman, much less someone dressed as humbly as Emma. Once seated and with menus in their hands, an uncomfortable silence settled between them. Emma looked at the menu with wide eyes, clearly overwhelmed by the prices and elaborate names of the dishes. She began, her voice barely a whisper. I don't know what to order. Jack felt a pang of guilt. In his desire to talk in a quiet place, he hadn't considered how out of place Emma might feel in a luxury restaurant. How about I order for both of us? He suggested gently. I know the menu well and can recommend some dishes that I'm sure you'll like. Emma nodded, visibly relieved. While Jack placed the order, she looked around, absorbing every detail of the luxurious environment. Sarah used to tell me about places like this, Emma commented, once the waiter had withdrawn. She would tell me about the gala, dinners, the charity events. She always sounded so excited when she talked about those things. Jack felt a lump in his throat. Sarah loved those events, he said hoarsely. She had a gift for making everyone feel special, important. She was the life of every party. I know, Emma smiled. She taught me how to behave in formal situations, you know. She said I might need it someday. Jack looked at her curiously. She taught you etiquette? Emma nodded. That and much more. She taught me to read, to write, to appreciate art and music. She took me to museums and concerts when she could. She said that education was the key that would open all doors. Sounds like something Sarah would say, Jack murmured, a mixture of love and pain in his voice. The waiter arrived with their appetizers, momentarily interrupting the conversation. As they ate, Jack observed Emma. Despite her worn clothes and her evident initial discomfort, there was a natural grace in her movements, a refinement that spoke of Sarah's influence. Emma, Jack said after a moment, there's something I don't understand. If Sarah gave you such a complete education, how did you end up on the street? Emma's face darkened. After Sarah died, things got complicated. The money she had left for my maintenance ran out faster than expected. I tried to get a job, but without an official degree or work experience, no one wanted to hire me, and then she broke off, biting her lower lip. Jack waited patiently, sensing that what was coming wouldn't be easy to hear. I met a man, Emma finally continued. His name was Mark. He was charming, attentive. He promised me the world. I was young and naive, and I fell completely under his influence. I abandoned my studies, distanced myself from the few people who still cared about me, and when Mark asked me to lend him the money I had left to invest in a sure business, I didn't hesitate for a second. Jack closed his eyes, anticipating what would come next. Of course, Mark disappeared with the money, Emma said bitterly. He left me with nothing, alone and in debt. I had no choice but to return to the streets. I'm so sorry, Jack murmured, reaching out to take Emma's hand in a gesture of comfort. It must have been terrible for you. Emma nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. There were moments when I thought about giving up, when the pain and desperation were too much. But then I would remember Sarah, remember everything she had done for me, and I would find the strength to keep going. Jack felt a mixture of admiration and guilt. Admiration for Emma's strength and guilt for not having been there to help her. Emma, he said seriously, I want to help you. I know it's late, that I should have been there before, but if you'll let me, I'd like to do something for you now. Emma looked at him with a mixture of hope and distrust. Why? You barely know me. Because Sarah loved you, Jack replied, without hesitation, and because I see in you the same spirit, the same strength that I saw in her. I can't change the past, but I can try to make things right now. Before Emma could respond, Jack's phone vibrated. He looked at the screen and frowned. I'm sorry I have to take this call, he apologized, getting up from the table. It's from the office. I won't be long. As Jack walked away to talk on the phone, Emma was left alone at the table, her mind a whirlwind of contradictory emotions and thoughts. On one hand, Jack's offer was tempting. After years of struggle and deprivation, the idea of having some stability, some security, was almost overwhelming. On the other hand, could she really trust this man she barely knew? Wouldn't she be betraying Sarah's memory by accepting his help? Lost in her thoughts, Emma didn't notice the man approaching the table until he was standing next to her. Excuse me, miss, the man said in a soft voice. I couldn't help but notice that you're dining with Jack Thompson. May I ask how you know Mr. Thompson? Emma looked at the man with surprise and a bit of wariness. He was tall, elegant-looking, with graying hair and penetrating eyes that looked at her intently. It's a long story, Emma replied, uncomfortable. Who are you? The man smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Excuse my lack of manners. My name is Robert Wilson. I'm an old friend of Jack's and of Sarah's. Upon hearing Sarah's name, Emma visibly tensed. Robert seemed to notice her reaction, and his smile widened. I see you know Sarah, he said in a tone that Emma found dangerously soft. How interesting, Jack never mentioned having a friend who knew his late wife. Before Emma could respond, Jack returned to the table. When he saw Robert, his face hardened. "Robert," he said coldly, "what are you doing here?" Robert turned to Jack, his smile still in place. "Jack, old friend. What a coincidence to find you here. I was just greeting your charming companion." Jack looked at Emma, who seemed visibly uncomfortable. "Robert, I'd appreciate it if you'd let us dine in peace," he said, in a tone that brooked no argument. Robert raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. Of course, I didn't mean to interrupt. Have a pleasant evening." Before leaving, Robert leaned towards Emma and whispered something in her ear. Then, with a last enigmatic smile, he walked away. Jack sat down, his face a mask of concern. "Emma, are you okay? What did Robert say to you?" Emma, pale and trembling, looked at Jack with eyes full of fear. He told me to be careful, that there are secrets that are best left buried." Jack felt a chill run down his spine. The appearance of Robert Wilson, a former business partner with whom he had disagreements in the past, couldn't be a coincidence. "Emma," Jack said urgently, "there's something I need to tell you. Something about the past, about Sarah, and about Robert Wilson." As Jack began to speak, Emma felt she was on the edge of a precipice, about to discover truths that could change everything. And somewhere in the city, Robert Wilson smiled, knowing that the pieces of the game were starting to move. The atmosphere in the restaurant had changed drastically. What had started as a quiet dinner had turned into something much more tense and complex. Jack looked around, making sure no one could hear them, before leaning towards Emma. "Emma," he began, his voice barely a whisper. "What I'm going to tell you is something I've kept secret for years, something that not even Sarah knew completely." Emma nodded, her face a mixture of fear and curiosity. "I'm listening, Jack." Jack took a deep breath before continuing. "Robert Wilson isn't just an old friend or business partner. He and we were involved in some transactions that weren't entirely legal." Emma's eyes widened in surprise. "What do you mean by not entirely legal?" "Years ago, when my company was just starting, we urgently needed capital," Jack explained, guilt evident in his voice. "Robert offered to help us. He introduced us to some investors who were willing to contribute large sums of money. At that moment, I didn't ask too many questions about the origin of those funds." "Oh, Jack," Emma murmured, understanding the gravity of the situation. "Over time, I discovered that the money came from illicit activities," Jack continued. "Money laundering mainly. By the time I realized I was already too involved, Robert had me in his hands." "Did Sarah know?" Emma asked. Jack shook his head. "Not entirely. She suspected something wasn't right, but she never knew the details. I protected her from that truth." "And what happened next?" Emma urged. "I tried to distance myself from Robert and his shady businesses," Jack said. "I used a large part of the company's legitimate earnings to return the dirty money little by little, but Robert wasn't happy with that. He wanted us to keep collaborating." Jack paused, his eyes full of pain. The night of Sarah's accident. "She and I had argued. I was stressed, worried about Robert and his threats. Sarah felt I was hiding something from her. She left the house angry, and then—" His voice broke. Unable to continue, Emma reached out, taking Jack's hand in a gesture of comfort. "It wasn't your fault, Jack," she said softly. Jack looked at her, grateful for her understanding. "Thank you, Emma. But there's more. After Sarah's death, Robert came to see me. He told me he had information about the accident, that it hadn't been a simple traffic accident." Emma tensed. "What do you mean?" "Robert insinuated that the accident might have been provoked," Jack said, his voice barely audible. "He never gave me concrete evidence, but the idea has tormented me for years. What if Sarah died because of me? Because of my mistakes?" Emma squeezed Jack's hand. "Jack, you can't blame yourself for something like that. Robert could be lying, manipulating you." I know," Jack nodded, "but the doubt has always been there. And now, with your appearance, with Sarah's secrets coming to light, I fear Robert is planning something." "Do you think my presence could be a threat to him?" Emma asked, concern evident in her voice. "It's possible," Jack admitted. "If there's something else Sarah knew, something she might have told you." Emma frowned, thoughtful. Sarah never mentioned Robert by name, but there was something. Shortly before she died, she talked to me about an important secret. She said she had left instructions that when the time was right, I would know what to do. Jack leaned forward, his interest palpable. "What kind of instructions? Where did she leave them?" "I don't know," Emma admitted. "She never got to tell. The accident happened shortly after." Jack leaned back in his chair, his mind working at full speed. "We have to find those instructions, Emma. They could be the key to understanding all of this." "But where do we start?" Emma asked. "From the beginning," Jack said with determination. "We're going to visit all the places that were important to Sarah. Her office at the charitable foundation, our old house, even the apartment where she raised you. She must have left some clue." Emma nodded, a spark of hope in her eyes. "Okay, let's do it." Just as they were about to get up, Jack's phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. Jack opened it and felt his blood run cold. "Lies have short legs, Jack. The past always catches up with us. Take good care of your new friend. It would be a shame if something happened to her like it did to Sarah." Jack looked at Emma, fear evident in his eyes. "We have to go now." As they hurriedly left the restaurant, neither of them noticed the figure watching them from a car parked across the street. Robert Wilson smiled to himself, taking out his phone to make a call. "They're on the move," he said quietly. "Follow them, but keep your distance. I want to know every step they take." He hung up the phone and started his car, discreetly following Jack's vehicle. The game had barely begun, and Robert was determined to win no matter the cost. Meanwhile, in Jack's car, Emma looked out the window, her mind a whirlwind of questions and fears. "Jack," she finally said, "do you think we're in danger?" Jack gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white from the force. "I don't know, Emma, but I promise you I'll do everything possible to keep you safe. I won't lose anyone else because of my mistakes." As the car delved into the night, both felt they were on the verge of something big, something that could change their lives forever. The secrets of the past were about to come to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. Somewhere in the city, in a forgotten safe, a yellowed envelope patiently waited to be discovered inside. Sarah's last words, a map to the truth that both Jack and Emma desperately sought. The race against time had begun, and both their fates hung by a thread. The night enveloped the city in a cloak of darkness. When Jack's car stopped in front of an imposing mansion, Emma looked out the window, her eyes widening in amazement at the magnificence of the house. "Is this where you lived with Sarah?" she asked quietly. Jack nodded, his face a mask of contained emotions. "Yes, I haven't been here in years after Sarah's death. I couldn't bear to keep living in this house. Too many memories." They got out of the car and approached the front door. Jack took a key out of his pocket, his hands trembling slightly as he inserted it into the lock. With a click, the door opened, revealing an elegant interior covered in white sheets and a thin layer of dust. "Where do we start?" Emma asked, her voice barely a whisper in the sepulchral silence of the house. Jack turned on the lights, illuminating the magnificent foyer. "Sarah's study," he replied. "If she left any clue, it's likely to be there." They climbed the stairs and headed towards a door at the end of the hallway. Jack stopped in front of it, his hand on the doorknob, as if gathering the courage to open it. "Are you okay?" Emma asked gently. Jack nodded, took a deep breath, and opened the door. Sarah's study was a spacious and bright room, with bookshelves covering the walls and a large wooden desk as the centerpiece. "It's exactly as she left it," Jack murmured, his voice laden with emotion. They entered the room, their eyes scanning every detail, looking for something, anything, that could be a clue. "Jack, look at this," Emma called after a few minutes. She was standing in front of one of the bookshelves, pointing to a particular book. "It's Pride and Prejudice. Sarah used to read it to me when I was a child." Jack approached, frowning. "And what's special about it?" Emma took the book off the shelf and opened it. Look, there's a mark on this page and some words are underlined. Jack leaned over the book, his eyes scanning the underlined lines. There are secrets that time reveals. Truth, though painful, sets us free. In the place where everything began, you will find the answers. This has to mean something, Jack said, his mind working at full speed. The E, place where everything began. Where could it be? Emma closed her eyes, thinking intensely. Sarah used to talk to me about a park, she finally said. She said it was where she met you, where everything began for you two. Jack's eyes lit up with recognition. Central Park. Of course, how could I forget? That's where we met, where I proposed to her. We have to go there, Emma said urgently. Just as they were about to leave, the sound of breaking glass resonated from downstairs. Jack and Emma looked at each other, fear reflected in their eyes. Someone's broken in, Jack whispered. Quick, this way. He took Emma's hand and guided her to a panel on the wall. He pressed it and it opened, revealing a secret passage. Sarah insisted we install this, Jack explained as they entered the dark hallway. She said you never knew when we might need an emergency exit. They advanced silently through the narrow passage, their hearts beating fast. Behind them, they could hear muffled footsteps and voices. Finally, the passage led them to a garage separate from the main house. Jack headed to a car covered with a tarp. This was Sarah's favorite car, he said, as he removed the tarp, revealing an elegant classic automobile. I hope it still works. To his relief, the engine started on the first try. Jack and Emma quickly got into the vehicle and left the garage just as they heard voices approaching. As they sped away, Emma looked in the rearview mirror and saw two dark figures emerging from the garage. They're following us, Jack, she said with a trembling voice. Jack pressed the accelerator, his knuckles white from gripping the steering wheel. Don't worry, we'll lose them. They zigzagged through the city streets, Jack using all his knowledge of alleys and shortcuts to throw off their pursuers. After what seemed like an eternity, they finally managed to lose them. Jack directed the car towards Central Park, parking at a prudent distance. Are you okay? He asked Emma, noticing how pale she was. She nodded, though her hands were still shaking. Yes, just a little scared. Who do you think they were? Probably Robert's men, Jack replied gravely. This confirms we're on the right track. Whatever Sarah hid, Robert wants it desperately. They got out of the car and entered the park. Despite the late hour, there were a few couples strolling and enjoying the starry night. Sarah and I used to sit on a bench near the central fountain, Jack said, guiding Emma along a path lit by antique lampposts. They reached the fountain, a beautiful marble structure with cherubs and nymphs dancing among jets of water. Jack stopped in front, of a worn wooden bench. This is it, he said, his voice barely a whisper. This is where I asked her to marry me. They sat on the bench, their eyes scrutinizing every detail, looking for something out of the ordinary. It was Emma who noticed it first. Jack, look, she said, pointing to a small engraving on the wood of the bench. It was almost imperceptible, but there it was. A tiny fleur-de-lis, Sarah's favorite symbol. Jack ran his fingers over the engraving, and, to his surprise, a small section of the wood moved. Carefully, he lifted it, revealing a secret compartment. Inside was a yellowed envelope. With trembling hands, Jack took it out and opened it. Inside was a letter and an old key. It's Sarah's handwriting, he said, his voice broken with emotion. He began to read aloud. My dear Jack, if you're reading this, it means you've discovered the truth about Emma and have begun to unravel the secrets I was forced to keep. Forgive me for not telling you everything, but it was the only way to protect you and our little Emma. The key that accompanies this letter opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank. Inside, you'll find all the evidence you need to expose Robert Wilson and his illegal business. You'll also find documents that prove your innocence in this whole affair. But be careful, my love. Robert is dangerous and will stop at nothing to keep his secrets hidden. Trust Emma, she's stronger and smarter than you think. Together, you can do what I couldn't. Unmask Robert and put an end to his crimes. I love you, Jack. I always did. and I always will. Take care of our Emma. With all my love, Sarah. Jack looked up from the letter, tears flowing freely down his cheeks. Emma was also crying, overwhelmed by the words of the woman who had been like a mother to her. She knew everything, Jack said, his voice filled with wonder and pain. She was trying to protect us both. Emma took Jack's hand, squeezing it gently. And now it's up to us to finish what she started. Just then, the sound of approaching footsteps alerted them. Jack quickly tucked the letter and key into his pocket. "We have to go," he said, standing up and pulling Emma along. They began to run through the park, aware that their pursuers were close. The race for the truth had become a race for their lives, and time was running out. As they ran towards the park exit, Jack realized they were no longer simply looking for answers. They were in the middle of a battle that Sarah had begun years ago, and that now depended on them to finish. With Sarah's letter burning in his pocket and the sound of their pursuers getting closer, Jack and Emma plunged into the night, determined to uncover the truth no matter the cost. The sun was beginning to peek over the horizon, tinting the sky in pink and golden hues when Jack and Emma arrived at First National Bank. They had spent the night moving from one place to another, avoiding Robert's men and preparing for this crucial moment. "Are you ready?" Jack asked, looking at Emma with a mixture of concern and determination. Emma nodded, her face showing a resolution that went beyond her years. More than ever, it's time for the truth to come to light. They entered the bank just as it was, opening its doors. Jack approached an employee, showing the key and requesting access to the corresponding safety deposit box. After verifying his identity, they were led to a private room where they were given a metal box. With trembling hands, Jack inserted the key into the lock. The click-it, produced as it opened, seemed to resonate in the silent room. Inside the box was a thick folder and a USB drive. "This is it," Jack murmured, quickly, leafing through the documents. Financial records, emails, photographs. Sarah compiled all the necessary evidence to expose Robert. Emma examined the USB drive. "Do you think we should look at it now?" Before Jack could answer, his phone vibrated. It was a message from an unknown number. "You have something that belongs to me. I'll be waiting for you at the old abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. Come alone or the consequences will be unpleasant. R.W." Jack showed the message to Emma, who visibly paled. "It's a trap," she said. "I know," Jack replied, "but we don't have a choice. Robert is dangerous and we don't know what else he might do." They took a taxi to the indicated location, the journey passing in tense silence. The abandoned factory loomed before them, a decrepit building that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. "Whatever happens," Jack said as they approached the entrance, "I want you to know that I'm proud of you, Emma. Sarah would be proud of the woman you've become." Emma smiled weakly, squeezing Jack's hand. "Thank you. We're in this together." As they entered the factory, they were greeted by the echo of their own footsteps in the empty space. Suddenly the lights came on, revealing Robert Wilson standing in the center of the room, flanked by two menacing-looking men. "Jack, my old friend," Robert said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "and young Emma, how touching to see you working together, almost like a family." "It's over, Robert," Jack replied, his voice firm. "We have all the evidence necessary to expose you. Your crimes, your dirty business, everything." Robert laughed, a cold sound devoid of humor. "Do you really think it's that simple? I've built an empire, Jack. I have connections you can't even imagine. Do you think a few papers can stop me?" "They're not just papers," Emma intervened. "Sarah documented everything. Every illegal transaction, every bribe, every threat, it's all here." Robert's smile faltered for a moment. Sarah was always too smart for her own good. It's a shame what happened to her. Jack took a step forward, anger evident on his face. "What do you mean by that? Did you have something to do with her death?" Robert sighed dramatically. "Oh, Jack, do you really want to know the truth? Sarah discovered too much. She became inconvenient. I had to take measures." "You killed her," Jack shouted, lunging towards Robert. Robert's bodyguards moved to intercept him, but Emma was faster. In a move that took everyone by surprise, she pulled out a small gun from her jacket and pointed it directly at Robert. "Don't move," she ordered, her voice surprisingly calm. Robert raised his hands, surprise evident on his face. "Well, well. The little orphan has claws after all." "Sarah taught me more than good manners," Emma replied. "She also taught me how to protect myself and how to protect those I love." At that moment, the sound of sirens filled the air through the factory's broken windows. The lights of several police cars could be seen approaching. "What have you done?" Robert growled, looking at Jack furiously. Jack smiled, taking his phone out of his pocket. "I activated the audio recording as soon as we entered your confession about Sarah. It's all here, and I just sent it to the police along with our location." Robert's eyes widened in horror as he realized he was cornered. He made a sudden move, as if he was going to pull out a weapon, but Emma was quicker. She fired, the bullet grazing Robert's arm and making him fall to the ground. In a matter of seconds, the police burst into the building. Robert and his men were quickly subdued and handcuffed. As the officers took Robert away, he looked at Jack with a mixture of hatred and resignation. "This isn't over, Thompson. I have powerful friends. This isn't the end." Jack looked at him steadily, years of pain and anger finally finding their release. "You're wrong, Robert. It is the end for you. At least..." When the last police car drove away, Jack and Emma were left alone in the abandoned factory. The silence surrounding them seemed charged with unexpressed emotions. "Are you okay?" Jack asked softly. Emma nodded, putting away the gun. "Sarah gave it to me years ago. She said she hoped I'd never have to use it, but that the world could be a dangerous place." Jack looked at her with a mixture of amazement and pride. "You're incredible. Emma, Sarah would be so proud of you." "Of us," Emma corrected with a small smile. "We did it together." They left the factory, the sun now high in the sky bathing them in its warm light. They stopped for a moment, looking towards the horizon. "What do we do now?" Emma asked. Jack put an arm around her shoulders. "Now, we honor Sarah's memory. We use the evidence to clear my name and make sure Robert and his accomplices pay for their crimes." "And then what?" Emma urged. "Then we start anew," Jack replied with a genuine smile. "As a family. If you want to, of course." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "I'd love that." As they walked together towards an uncertain but hope-filled future, both felt Sarah's presence, as if she were guiding and protecting them. The secrets had been revealed, the lies exposed, and although the path hadn't been easy, they had found something precious in the process: each other. The sun shone brightly, symbolizing not only the beginning of a new day, but the start of a new life for Jack and Emma. A life built on truth, love, and the legacy of an extraordinary woman who, even from beyond the grave, had found a way to unite and heal the broken hearts she had left behind. And so as they walked away from the abandoned factory, leaving the past behind and looking towards the future, Jack and Emma knew that, whatever happened, they would face what was to come together as a family. Just as Sarah had always wanted.